It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the first day of the event, Mr. Sabelo Mhlambi. The title of this keynote is "The Future Isn't White: Examining the Current Shifts at the Intersection of Human Rights, Ethics and Technology." Sabelo Mhlambi is a researcher at the world-renowned Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and his work focuses on the ethical implications of technology in the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, along with the creation of tools to make artificial intelligence more accessible and inclusive to underrepresented communities. Last year, Sabelo was a Technology and Human Rights Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy in Harvard University. And Sabelo is also founder of Bantocracy, a tech and tech policy platform focused on Ubuntu ethics. Over to you, Sabelo.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the very generous introduction. It is truly a pleasure to be speaking before all of you, and it is an honor to share just a few thoughts on what the future can look like and why we should desire a different future and a different alternative. The future is not white, and I am here to tell you why that is a good thing. Not only is it a desirable thing that the future is not white, but I believe that this is a future which we should all embrace and a future which we should ensure becomes a reality. I believe that this is especially so in the human rights community, for it is in our shared interest to have a society that does not accord special privileges to whiteness. It is in our interest to ensure that true and widespread rights that affirm human dignity and rights that place humans over profit are everywhere. And I would imagine that this is agreeable and that this is a welcome change that we should all endeavor and strive for, that we should work for a society that does not perpetuate white supremacy in any of its forms. Yes, the future is not white, and it should not be. The future must be one in which we all belong, in which the nature of human rights and of technology used in the human rights field and the technology used in society actually protects the dignity and worth of those who are most marginalized. Now, if any of this should make any of us feel uncomfortable, perhaps it is because I'm inviting each of us to touch and re-examine the central nerve of society, the central nerve within the human rights world, the global economy, and global political order. What I am suggesting to you today and asking from each of us is to consider an idea that seeks to structurally undo and fundamentally transform a way of life that we may have become used to, or familiar with, and comfortable with. I am asking each of us to perhaps sit with a degree of discomfort as the necessary first step to unseating the heartbeat, the foundation, and the background hum of society, which of course is white supremacy. Now, I believe that all of us at our core agree that we do not want a future that gives special status to whiteness. And if we took the opposing position today, I believe that we would find that if we took the opposing position, stating that whiteness, for some reason, due to its own merit or worthiness, deserves special recognition and status, this would be an unpopular position. It would be quite difficult today in the post-colonial world to try to advance such an idea. And equally so, due to the work and to the testimony and experiences of mostly non-white scholars, it may be also unpopular or uncritical to deny the gaps in the outcomes between white and non-white societies, between white families and non-white families, whether in Europe or whether in America. The gaps in wealth, education, and health outcomes disproportionately negatively impact non-white populations. This we know. And these gaps are intricately connected to the very institution of white supremacy. Now, non-white global South scholars have been producing this work for decades, showing these inconsistencies, showing these contradictions. And there has been much work that has been done in the fields of decoloniality and decolonization that makes evident that the legacy of white supremacy still exists today, and that it affects us even today. I would believe that we are aware to some extent that society today does place a premium and a priority on whiteness. It places a premium and priority on the protection and proliferation of whiteness. And we are increasingly aware that this trend is also being reproduced through algorithmic technology. When we recognize technology that is now enforcing biases that tend to disproportionately affect already marginalized populations. Yes, artificial intelligence today is also affirming and protecting the role of white supremacy. Now, if the current status quo, if it is true that it does place a premium on whiteness, and if it is true that we do not want a society, whether now or in the future, that does place a premium on whiteness, then we must have a corresponding duty, and maybe even a desire to remove society's widespread and pervasive premium and preference on whiteness. Now, what does this mean? This means that today we are asked, from now and onward, to actively participate in decolonizing society. We are asked to participate in the decolonial processes. We're asked to participate in decolonizing technology, decolonizing AI, decolonizing the world of human rights, which also means first decolonizing our notions and our understanding of what it even means to be human in the very first place. We must deconstruct and redefine the qualities and aspects that are so significant to achieving human dignity in ways that actually broaden human rights protections. We must examine today, what does it really mean to be human? And what responsibility does that definition place on us? Now, if we go back to early Western philosophy, personhood was defined as fundamentally rational. To be human essentially was to have the ability to be rational. It was claimed by the early philosophers that rationality was that unique characteristic that made us human, and that being rational is sort of an individual activity. So therefore, we were self-sufficient, we were independent. One's rationality was not constrained to the rationality of others. And it was thought that through the power of the mind, the individual could have mastery over nature. And then through this process, achieve self-fulfillment. It was thought that because of rationality, individuals were to be seen as autonomous and self-independent beings. Rational, self-sufficient human beings were the basis of society. And all that was needed for a harmonious society was to have liberty for the individual being, liberty and equality, equality before the law. Not only was this idea pervasive during the Enlightenment era, it influenced the early articulations of human rights, and it centered them on this individualistic orientation. The individual became the central focus of society. Artificial intelligence also borrowed and developed heavily from this early conception of personhood. For in reality, artificial intelligence is truly a quest to create artificial persons. It is a quest to create artificial personhood. These are machines that can either match or surpass human thinking and abilities. And it was assumed that machines, through the rules of logic, through mathematics, could match the certainty that human thinking could provide. Now, this has left us today with the idea that machines are somehow objective, that they're rational, or that they're unbiased. And this all stems from this early philosophy that rationality alone is sufficient, whether in human beings, whether in society, that it alone is sufficient to achieve human aims. Now, such a view, whether it's in the world of technology, or in the world of human rights, is fundamentally flawed, and it is broken. It is riddled with contradictions that were always present from the onset and can only lead to more inequality. The so-called achievements of the Enlightenment era were always accompanied by an equally graver side, an underside, grave consequences for non-Europeans. Rationality has always been accompanied by oppression. A focus on the supremacy of the individual has always been accompanied by massive inequality and hypocrisy within Western society. Whether it's the economic structures, capitalism's free markets built on the forced markets of colonialism, political structures, individualism imposed through coloniality, and discriminatory social hierarchies that were justified, racism and sexism justified as institutions embedded in these rationalized social and gender exclusions from full person status. All of these exclusions, all of these contradictions, all of these inequalities in turn shape the data, the creation, and the function of artificial intelligence. So this is all connected. The dominant views that we have today, the dominant conception of human rights, the dominant orientation of artificial intelligence, the prevalence of surveillance capitalism, these are not there because they are the best ideas or that the best ideas won. These systems are not there because they are more fit or worthy in society. These systems are here simply because of a legacy of violence and a legacy of inequality. The European and American thinkers knew this, and they even predicted within their framework of governance and thinking. And they suggested early on that liberty and equality could not both coexist. Now, this definitely presents some problems when we can say that liberty and equality cannot both coexist in the same world. This contention was that a society would always have to choose and decide between liberty or equality, and that if a choice should be made, liberty would always have to win over inequality. In fact, inequality was seen as sort of the necessary price, the necessary precondition for liberty. Now, if some of these early thinkers, Hegel, Alexander Hamilton, and their contemporaries are correct in that inequality is necessary for liberty, then the Human Rights Project, along with technology based on this idea of the rational person, based on the supremacy of rationality, are both undermined from the start and incapable of fully protecting human dignity. The laws and principles that assert individual autonomy and individual supremacy also make it possible for massive inequality. They make it possible for extreme inequality, extreme income inequality. In modern societies, how we experience liberty is often a function of economic power. It's a function of wealth, a function of money. Those with more money essentially have more liberty, more autonomy. And we must ask ourselves, are these the societies that we wish to have now and in the future, where we have different degrees of liberty and autonomy simply based on how much wealth one has? This prophecy has been fulfilled over and over and over again. We have yet to see today societies where liberty and equality both exist. In the United States, a country that has had democracy for a long time, we still find it even hard today, even difficult today, to still fully realize the rights of the Black population. Now, one can wonder that if a nation or a society continuously fails for decades, for centuries, in protecting the rights of its most marginalized, is it truly intending to protect the rights? Or is that such a project is already undermined from the start and maybe may not be possible to achieve with the current frameworks that we do have? Now, these are realizations that were made known as early as the 1960s by African writers and other writers across the Global South, from Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who came up with the term neo-colonization, and Walter Rodney of Guyana. They show the problems and the contradictions that came along with this conception of human rights, this conception of being human, and the institutions that develop and come from that conception. Hegel believed this centuries before. Hegel believed that capitalism, for example, could only work in Europe if Europeans colonized other people. Otherwise, Europeans would have to face extreme poverty within Europe. So this is the central point, that the issues behind algorithmic technology, that the issues that prevent current major human rights frameworks from achieving widespread human dignity and protection, that these issues are all interrelated. They stem from the same type of thinking, the same type of philosophy, the same value systems, the same prioritization that ultimately serves the group in power. They ultimately do little to nothing to confront white supremacy, dignity, and worth in ways that are meaningful. And therefore, we must today redefine what it means to be human. And we must take this new conception and imagine a new set of human rights, new governance frameworks, a new technology, new ways of thinking about and using technology in ways that can counter the continued legacy of colonialism that we live in. Now, to an extent, this may be uncomfortable because essentially it is a call to decenter Western narratives and Western perspectives. This is a call in which human rights becomes increasingly defined by those populations who are most vulnerable in society: refugees, immigrants, indigenous people, people in the global South. This is a future in which power is redistributed from its current centralization and even from the current tokenization processes. This is a future in which Western organizations have to go into these communities, into the indigenous communities, into the global South, to begin to find a new sense and inspiration and direction. This is a reality in which the Western world acknowledges that whiteness itself, whiteness as an institution, is the greatest violator of human rights. And we find this idea all across Latin America, all across Sub-Saharan Africa, that whiteness invades our privacy. It does subvert our autonomy. It enters into our minds. It changes how we see ourselves. It shifts how we relate to each other, how we relate to society, how we relate to the environment. And it does so in ways that assert and enforce white supremacy. Our minds become colonized, and our attitudes and beliefs are changed in ways that distort true justice, in ways that make it impossible to actually and effectively achieve equality. Now, all of us play a role in this reality. White and non-white, we all participate, and we play a role in various degrees in this reality. But the facts are evident, and intuitively we do know it, that we all do not benefit from or achieve or experience the same quality of life. We know that there is a massive gap, a gap based on geography, a gap based on economic class, a gap based on social and racial lines. In the United States, we know through the data that white families on average have a wealth gap that is 10 times that of Black families. We know from the data that white high school graduates tend to be wealthier than Black college graduates. But we are often told that if communities become more rational, if communities become more productive, if they work more, if they work harder, if communities become more rights oriented, if they respect human rights, that the gaps will narrow. We're told that if societies use more artificial intelligence, poverty can be addressed, that biases can be eliminated. In some cases, we're told that if African nations are more human rights oriented, that poverty would be minimized. Yet there is no correlation between such human rights frameworks based on the supremacy of the individual with actual economic outcomes. And there is no correlation to using artificial intelligence that it actually does reduce poverty or that it does increase equality in society. And in fact, the evidence now increasingly suggests that the inverse may actually be true, that these ideologies actually create and sustain poverty. They create and sustain inequality. We may be sensitive to the idea that we must decenter the North, decenter these Western dominant narratives. And we may find that the redistribution of wealth, of power, of status as an offensive, or maybe even a leftist idea, socialist or communist idea. That there must be other ways where marginalized populations can climb out of their oppression. That we can find ways to narrow the gap without looking at policies that seek to redistribute power. But that is impossible. We cannot simply bridge the gap that has been created by centuries of oppression, by centuries of colonial attitudes. The gap that has been created can never be filled, can never be achieved in any other way. We cannot work ourselves up to fill this gap. We cannot respect more rights to fill this gap. This gap was artificially created, and this gap needs to be reduced. But the solutions which we may be looking at may be the wrong solutions. Maybe we need to find other alternatives that inform us and that give us a framework on how to properly redistribute power. There must be a process of decentering. There must be a process of decolonizing. There must be a process of creating a future that isn't white like the past, but a future in which we can all belong. Now, there are many robust frameworks for doing so that we can find across the Global South. There are frameworks of doing so that we can find across indigenous communities. And Ubuntu is one such framework. It is a framework that comes from South Africa. Ubuntu itself, in its etymology, it talks about human dignity, the process of being human, and it centers on restoration and reconciliation. One thing that is lacking in the conversations that we have today is that the process of narrowing the gap, narrowing the inequalities, is that marginalized populations have to do the work to narrow this gap. But we rarely talk about restoration, about reconciliation, about redistributing the wealth, redistributing power. But we need to start imagining or finding frameworks that allow us to have this language, that allow us to not only work to prevent harm or to do no evil or to do no harm, but we need frameworks that also give us the tools and the ability to actually repair harm, the tools to actually fix harm. When harm is being done, we need to have frameworks and ways to fix that harm, frameworks that can actually bridge the gap. We need frameworks that see the human as not just purely rational or just purely an individual. We need to have frameworks that encourage society to play an active role in the life of the individual. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, for example, is the only legally binding international document, legislation that does incorporate the third wave of human rights. There are various attempts to try to include more rights, to extend human rights frameworks, to make it more encompassing in order to protect the rights of all. And so we need to find such instruments and such frameworks and find ways in which we can incorporate these ideas that may decenter Western dominant narratives. The solutions are there, but we must understand that they are no longer the exclusive property or the exclusive domain of the Western world. And this is the way it must be. In order to truly achieve a world in which human rights are felt and experienced by even the most marginalized, we have a duty. We have a duty to expand human rights. We have a duty to confront the contradictions. We have a duty to confront the reality that we have today. We each have a responsibility to decenter Western and white narratives and realize that the world is much, 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 much more diverse than how the lenses of colonialism and capitalism have viewed it. So it is our duty, therefore, today to ensure that the future does belong to us. It is our duty to ensure that the future belongs to every single human being. And it is up to us to ensure that the future isn't white. It is up to us to do the work of redistributing power, to do the work of bridging the gap, to do the work of reimagining societies, reimagining economies, reimagining social hierarchies, reimagining the redistribution of wealth, economic power status in such a way that the rights of those who are most marginalized can be affirmed. And once we begin to do this, whether in the human rights field, whether in the field of technology, or any other institution in society, we can then only begin to realize true equality, true human dignity, and true human worth. But it becomes impossible for us to reach such a state if we don't confront the main core inconsistencies, the main contradictions that prevent such work to be done. And in order to allow for such work to be done, we have to decenter ourselves from the dominant narratives, from patriarchy, from different Western concepts that stem from this idea, from this idea that is often stated in different ways, but this idea that is often really the weaponization of rationality. We need to truly begin to understand and to really envision and to redefine what it means to be human, and to realize that we are not just individuals who are self-complete, who can achieve all our aims purely by ourselves. We need to realize that such a view, such an understanding, such a conception of the world actually creates inequality, it actually leads to inequality, and that the inequality we have today is not by accident, it's not by chance, it is by design. And it stems from a particular type of thinking, a particular way of viewing the world. And we can have a different world today. We can work towards a different world. We can work towards a better future. We can work towards a more diverse and more encompassing future if we begin the work today and onwards to bring in other perspectives, to redefine what it means to be human, and to find frameworks that allow us to see the human being as part of society, a human being that is owed by society the chance to achieve human dignity and human worth. It is up to us to ensure that the future isn't just white. Thank you.